I would like to invite you to put yourself into the mind of the child, the son of the widow in Zarephath, from our reading this morning. Ever since your father died, unexpectedly, several years ago, you and your mother have been living on the very edge of survival. But things have only gotten worse over the last couple of months, as the entire countryside has suffered from a terrible drought. So everyone's been having a hard time. All of your friends have been struggling. But at least many of them have a few resources that they can fall back on. Some small savings, or perhaps even the ability to borrow. But you and your mother, you have nothing. Nothing, that is, except for one small jar of cracked barley and a little jug of oil. And as you've watched day after day, your mother has very carefully taken the very smallest amount of grain imaginable out of that pot and moistening it with just a little bit of the olive oil before frying up the resulting cake. And the cake has been so small that it barely even requires 2 sticks of wood to make a fire big enough to cook it. And your portion of the cake hardly even takes an edge off of your hunger. But it's not that alarms you the most. What alarms you most is to watch as that small store of meal, that little bit of oil, grows ominously smaller day after day after day, because you know there will be no more once it is gone. And then finally comes the day when you watch your mother very carefully divide everything that remains in half. Tomorrow she will make the last cake, and you both know it. The next morning, probably because she cannot even face the possibility of looking you in the eyes, she gets up even before you awake and goes out to gather the wood to build a fire, to prepare one last meal. And so you waken alone. You get washed and dressed, and you sit and wait for her to return. And when she's only been gone an hour, she comes back, and everything is suddenly different. She is carrying with her the usual 2 sticks of wood, but now she's flushed and excited, like you haven't seen her since your father died. And she breathlessly announces, "I have met a man of God." And she explains that she's about to take the meal out of the jar, the oil out of the jug, and she's going to make up a small cake to take to the prophet. After that, the prophet promises everything's going to be just fine for you and your mother. And my question to you this morning is this: how do you react to that? How do you feel? Because I suspect that most of us would be a little bit suspicious that perhaps your mother has just been taken in by a charlatan. There is a man in the woods out there who's taking advantage of poor widows, talking them into giving him their very last meals. And all logic and all reason would definitely be in our side thinking such things, wouldn't it? Isn't that the sensible way we all look at the question of scarce resources? When stock is limited supply, especially when it's of something that you find desirable or essential, everyone will assume that the sensible thing to do is to save, to ration, and to spend as sparingly as possible. And there is no denying that what the prophet asks this widow to do defies such sensible assumptions that we would make with limited resources. He invites her to be extravagant. and generous with what little she has, with the promise that this is what will prevent her from running out. Now, of course, you might say that this story is all about defying logic and reason because, of course, it's a miracle stories. A miracle story. Miracle stories are not supposed to make sense. Miracles require faith, which is the opposite of reason, isn't it? And yes, that's true on one level. This is a story of how amazing Elijah is and how God miraculously provided for him and helped a few other people along the way. But I think it would be a mistake to look at this as just a miracle story. Because you see, if it's just a miracle story, then it could only be applied to our lives in really extraordinary circumstances. But I believe that there's a principle at work in this story that does not just apply to extraordinary circumstances. There's something in this story that applies very directly to your life now, today. Because you see, there are two ways to look at that jar of meal and that jug of oil in the story. There is the way we're all inclined to look at it as a limited resource. And whenever you look at it that way, you will naturally fall into scarcity thinking, scarcity tactics. And when you're living by scarcity, you will save and ration and worry about what you don't have. But the problem with scarcity tactics is they are a form of self-fulfilling prophecy. And when you assume you're going to run out and you act accordingly, you will eventually run out. But in this story, Elijah comes along and invites this woman to look at her resources from a very different point of view. Rather than seeing them as scarce resources, he invites her to look at them as possibility and potential. And I would suggest to you that such a change in perspective can make an enormous difference, even when the practical number of resources that are available do not change. It can still change the outcome. Just a change in attitude. And what's more, though the change in attitude does require faith, the change in outcome does not always require a miracle to pull off, though it may feel that way. And I believe that this is a lesson that the church needs to learn and keep on learning. When I was first called to my second church, I went there and I spent some time talking to the people who had been there for a long time, to try and discover the people's history of that church. And this is, by the way, often time well spent. And so they told me about their church. And they told me that there had been a time not all that long before when their church had been poor. Membership was stagnating or dropping, but most especially money had been in short supply. And so they had been doing what, Presbyterian churches are pretty good at. They had cut all expenses to the bone. They were putting off repairs. They were really good at saving money. They were poor. So they responded with scarcity thinking. But you see, this church that I had gone to did not feel poor anymore. Oh, sure, sometimes they did struggle to balance the budget as most churches do, but they didn't act like they were poor. And so I asked them what had changed that. And they said that it started with a door, just a door. They had an old wooden door, a door that led out onto the street from the church. And it was drafty, and it was broken, and it had certainly seen better days. But you see, they couldn't afford to replace it. They didn't have the money. And since this door was the main entrance into the church from the community, it was almost like they'd put this great big sign on the front of the church for everyone to say, "We are poor." But one day, they just got to the place where they had no choice. They were cornered into a decision. They had to do it. They went ahead and replaced that old broken wooden door with a brand new glass door. And they were terrified. Oh, they could never afford such extravagance. They were sure that it was going to ruin them. But then an amazing thing happened. Almost overnight, without even trying, that door was paid for, just like that. And that experience opened them up to a different possibility. Maybe they weren't as poor as they thought they were. In fact, maybe they were only poor because they thought they were. Because you see, if you're just surviving and doling out scarce resources, for some reason, people don't find that particularly inspiring. It's not something that they're excited about supporting. But if they see the church doing something, even something as small as a new door, well, they start looking at supporting that in a very, very different way. And so that church learned an important lesson. And significantly, it was a lesson that they applied to more than just keeping the building up to date. They learned to stop thinking of their church as poor and having scarce resources. And as a result, that church went on to take some amazing risks, to do some exciting things in the community. And that is a lesson that I have tried to carry with me ever since. You know, many churches look at their jar of barley, their jug of oil, and come to the conclusion that they don't have a lot, and that they just better hold on to what they've got. They better save for themselves and cut back on ministry and mission to the people around them. This is the kind of scarcity thinking we fall into when we are motivated by anxiety and fear. And it always seems so very sensible. But this is not how the economy of God's church is supposed to operate. God sent Elijah to that widow in Zarephath to break her out of such thinking. And I wonder, who is God going to send to our churches to break us out of that kind of thinking? Oh, I wish that our churches would learn from what that widow learned from Elijah. It's also, by the way, a lesson that applies in many other places. It does have applications to national economies and government policies. Now, I'm no expert on such matters. I realize they're very complex, but I have at least noticed something. I've noticed that slashing and freezing government spending often does not have the effect of balancing budgets and eliminating deficits that we think it should. Often, in fact, such scarcity tactics make things much worse. The great classic example of this, of course, is the Great Depression. But it's actually something that has happened again and again throughout history. In the Depression, governments and just about everyone fell into this habit of thinking that resources, and especially money, were limited and needed to be rationed. And that kind of led to a self-fulfilling prophecy. The belief that money was scarce made people hold on to their money, which meant that it didn't circulate, and that made everything more and more scarce. Things spiraled out of control. The economy spiraled into terrible misery until something happened. And what happened was a change in attitude. The realities of a global war meant that there actually was no choice. in terms of spending enormous amounts of money. But here's the thing, the number of resources available had not changed. What had changed was the attitude about those resources and what was worth lavishing those resources on. And only such a dramatic change in thinking was able to break North American society out of that spiral of scarcity. But actually, I don't really want to focus on government spending or church spending today. But rather, I want to invite you to focus on something a little closer to home. Because here's the thing, I believe that all of us in certain areas of our lives do have a habit of behaving like that woman and her son. What I mean by that is that we all have resources in our life that we treat just like that woman treated her jar of meal and jug of oil. We live in fear and anxiety that whatever it is, whatever this limited resources is going to run out soon. And so we ration and share with others grudgingly, if at all. Now, I don't know what that resource might be for you in your life. Right? Do you live in anxiety constantly about money, not having enough money? Well, that's the resource in your life. That is a scarce resource for you. But maybe it's something else. Maybe it's time you never have enough of. Others struggle with lack of options, lack of appreciation, lack of love. Now these things, these resources are all good and necessary things to life. You deserve to have these things. God wants you to have them. And God has sent Elijah to you today to challenge you to consider that maybe your problem is not really how little you have of such a resource. Your problem is how you look at it, because you're looking at it as a scarcity problem. You see, you are a child of the King of Kings and Lord of Lords. You should never think of yourself as poor because of that. And God will always give to a person of faith not only enough, but enough to share in powerful and life-changing ways. So I'm here today to challenge you. This week I want you to act extravagantly and generously with some resource in your life. I want you to give it away. You know, it may be time, it may be treasure, it might be talent, whatever it is. But this is the key point. I want it to be something that you just do not feel you can spare. If you're a free spender of money, well, then that's not it. If money doesn't mean everything, you don't need to be giving more of it. No, you need to be extravagantly generous with something you just don't feel like you can afford to give. I want you to do it because you can only do it by faith. And if you do it, I believe that God may surprise you with the news that you're not as poor in that resource as you thought you were. Lord our God, it is so easy for us to fall into the trap of scarcity thinking, of thinking that we are poor, and living in constant anxiety and fear about what we don't have. Set us free from that. Thank you for this wonderful story where Elijah set that widow free from such thinking. Show us where in our lives we need to be set free by the practice of giving what we don't believe we can afford. Amen.